Thank you for joining us today for our webinar discussing automating digital CAD validation. Today's presenter is Tony Provincial, Director of Technical Sales and Services. Tony, I will turn things over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. And thanks everyone for joining today to talk about the topic of digital CAD validation and automation. My name is Tony Provincial, and I'm going to take the next 20 minutes or so to talk about the concepts of automation and some of the exciting things that we've done in the last year to help customers digitize this process. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers as well. So, digital CAD validation. ITI has been helping customers for decades to use tools to interrogate 3D models. And really there are three different areas where digital validation can prove very helpful. One is to look at just the original native quality of a CAD model and to look at items that may cause issues when that model is reused downstream. So looking for either problems with the geometry, or today, especially with the PMI and the manufacturing information that's included in models, trying to identify that early in the process so that it can be corrected before it may become an issue downstream. And that downstream reuse results in lots of different data types today. So the concept of derivative data formats and confirming that those items are identical to the released master model in the PLM system is more important than ever as companies are going full speed ahead with their digitization. They need to also ensure that all of these different data formats are complete and correct, and doing that in a manual checking process is very cumbersome and time consuming. And finally, that same ability to digitally compare things rather than manually review and compare can be applied to change processes and the comparison of two different revisions of a model. So not is this model identical? No, it's changed, but now documenting those changes and also documenting that there aren't unintentional changes. So all three of these areas are areas where validation approaches can be taken to really reduce the need for a human to do the comparison of these data types. And so the question is now, how can this be automated? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Really, digital validation, when you consider the automation of it, it's important to think about it from a user story or how the user interacts with the data. So one of the strengths of doing it digitally is that the data is evaluated in the systems where it was generated. So for the sake of the discussion today, we're talking about inputs like a CAD model or two CAD models or a CAD model and a derivative file like a STEP or a JT or a 3D PDF file. Those act as inputs, along with a template describing what checks you want to run. And really this is the piece that can be automated so that the users don't have to execute these steps. They really just can interact with the results. And we'll talk a little bit about how interacting with results is an important thing to consider when you automate any processes within PLM or other systems. So I'm going to quickly just show an example here of some CADIQ reports. So this is a 3D PDF file. It is a CADIQ report. So this one happens to be looking at a CAD file and reporting on the quality in that file. And this is an example of a type of report that would typically maybe put back into the PLM system. The nice thing about 3D PDF is users that are interacting with this report don't have to have any CADIQ licensing. So this is a very flexible report type to put back into the PLM system and give broader access to people. In similar nature, here's a quick example of a STEP file and a CAD file that was compared against a STEP file. 0 issues were found, and so that file receives a passing mark. And here's another PDF report just to correlate and see the idea that this model is a case where there were some issues here, so it got a failing mark. And for any model that has issues, you can go and dig deeper into those issues and see things like there's some extra thread geometry and surfaces that are in the STEP file that are not displayed in the original CAD file. And the digital validation does go through all levels of the data, so it can go through and check each of the saved views in a case like this where the model has MBD and identify things like different faces are highlighted. We can see here that there's a difference in highlighted faces. So just some examples of what users are interacting with when they get feedback, that data has been validated. Okay. When we look at the concept of automation, now we're taking this validation strategy off of a user's task list and off of their desktop, if you will. So one of the first objectives is we want to offload the processing. We want to validate the data within the PLM system so a user doesn't have to go and save a copy and do anything locally. We want to automate the steps of doing the validation, creating the report. In a lot of cases, this may be triggered from a workflow, and some of the information can be used for branching. And also, we want to ease the maintenance here. We want to reduce as much as possible pushing software out to lots of users. So if we can leverage standard formats like PDF for the information that the users work with, that helps in making this available to lots of people without having to install software. The analysis, process, often in automation, workflows can be a nice trigger, but also, especially on the quality checking, the ability to trigger it early on in the process where feedback can be helpful to a designer who's making changes or working on a new part. That can be important too, so that users have the ability to get this feedback before it goes through a formal release process or change process or workflow, so that if there are issues, that early feedback can allow them to be corrected kind of in the flow of work rather than as a roadblock in a future workflow. And again, the idea is get the results into a traceable environment. So there's no one size fits all here, but CADIQ produces a variety of results and reports that can be checked into PLM. So having that flexibility to put information back in adds that level of digital trust. Not only is the data validated, but this is information that if your business processes wanted to collect it and put these reports in a technical data package or other element, they can be stored and collected in PLM. And additionally, we'll talk briefly about dispositioning. So dispositioning is really the act of commenting on, the results of validation, and the idea that for items that may have a pass-fail rating, this step may not be required for items that pass. That may allow a business process to complete automatically, but in the context of a failure, how do you accommodate that in an automated environment? How do you put power in the hands of the users to capture important feedback and make the human decision to override or reject and correct and make those important engineering decisions? So those are really the objectives, that are typically met, and some of the important considerations to keep in mind in automating the process. Just have a couple of quick samples here to highlight the automation side of it. So some of these things, when we demonstrate these techniques in a moment, will be more of a black box. So just wanted to capture the idea here that when we do talk about workflow driven items, the end user may not even see a lot of what goes on behind the scenes, but the integration of CADIQ, the execution of everything that we're talking about can be done automatically. So, the code to execute and do the analysis, create and interpret the results, can be executed as part of a workflow. There's some examples here showing an example from a wind chill integration. And behind the scenes, that automated workflow, whether it's triggered by a user or through a workflow, is going to generate a lot of useful information, for the PLM support team to look at how they can incorporate this into each company's business process. So things like XML reports, a very structured way to query in detail what CADIQ found in the validation of data, different elements depending on the business process. You can find a variety of elements on the severity of issues and pass-fail type status. And that information can be written back everywhere from just exposing, pass-fail type highlight information as metadata back into PLM, or it can be used for branching and things of that nature. So I'm going to take a moment to show an example, of an integration and what it would look like in PLM. So switch over to my browser here. And I'm looking at a Creo part here and can look at further information, just a very standard, look at wind chill here where I have the CAD part. There's a new section here that has some of this validation information, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I also have some custom actions here. So here are some examples of user triggers right out of the box, things like setting a template if I want to give users access to change or select what rule sets. And all these options can be shown or hidden, very configurable, when you have a reference integration to use, such as this wind chill integration. And then I have the choice to do those different actions. Do I want to look at model quality? Do I want to validate, a derivative file like a STEP file? Do I want to compare revisions of a part? And as I select that, if I pick the compare option, it's going to automatically know the object that I'm looking at, and it gives me options to pick. So do I want to pick a previous revision to compare against? I'm on Rev B. It allows me to go back and compare it, in this case, to Rev A. If I had a B, C, D, I would have some options there. Also, the flexibility, if I created a new part that I used to save a copy from another part, it allows me the flexibility to go compare it to another part number. So, just little things here where, user flexibility is important to put some power in the user's hands if you want to, have that level of functionality, and if copying parts is a common design practice in your organization. And as that executes, essentially it goes off and runs on a server where CADIQ operates, loads all of the data it's provided, does the analysis, and returns back information. Here a fail, for instance, in the CADIQ report, and in the STEP file, a pass. So it's saying that it did find a potential quality issue in the CAD model, but the STEP model was exact and precise. So, if I go back and want to just send the STEP file to a vendor, I may want to check the failure here before sending, just to make sure it's not something that I want to correct before I send it out. And if I do check in, I can automatically rerun and reanalyze the STEP file. So that's a quick look at just the interface, and if I go to a different folder, I flip over to a folder that has some more data, CADIQ can also be triggered for multiple objects at a time. So either a select all or picking items, those action menus, picking the validate. With a validate, I may need to tell it what file I want to look at. You can see here, these files have some different formats available. So an IGES and a STEP file on this part happens to have two different STEP files. and I can go through and pick, what I want to validate here and let all of these be put in the queue on the server. So once something runs, if I go back to the part that I just was looking at, and I have those items. These are linked, so I can click on the hyperlink, and it is downloading the PDF file for me to open here. But really behind the scenes, what that's doing is if I just look at the item and look at the material, in this case, it's attaching the PDF file as well as a text report. That's another optional output type. So as everything runs, for Windchill, the default location is to put this information back as attachments. And this is also a spot where you can see the STEP file here that was validated. So the different PLM systems and different data models at different organizations may store data in different places. The reference integration for CADIQ can look at attachments, representations, and it can also be configured to look at related objects. So, a flexible model depending on what's under consideration. And these are important things to think about as you're looking at automated data formats. So as you're starting to think of publishing things beyond just the lightweight viewables, whether it's JT, Anarch PDF files, other 3D PDF, STEP, any of these formats, where that data is structured may change over time, but there's flexibility to handle lots of different data models as far as finding linked data to be selected by a user when a user wants to validate something. That all gets taken care of by the workflow code, that would be generated. So if the desire is to trigger a step validation or similar via a workflow, that can be handled, right in the workflow definition as to the selection of the right file. And I did have up, just a quick view of the workflow, in this system. So again, in Windchill, typically, validation is a step that is used to enhance existing workflows. So certainly you can create new workflows, but also just the configuration and adding of new tasks and items within a workflow, where in this case, as part of the promotion process, CADIQ is run, and then there's some branching that's done pending the results, where it may be rejected and sent back for a review, or it might be automatically passed on, if everything is clean, to complete the workflow process or move on to the next step of that process. So I'm gonna click back and highlight a few more items, included kind of a summary of a lot of the areas that we've worked with clients in to, support automating CADIQ as a validation strategy. So, you want to make it as simple as possible for users to review validation results. But the reality is that, there's a lot of complexity to validation, and, it's really important to have the flexibility and the technical capabilities to use different templates and different data types, because, what may be appropriate to validate in one workflow, may not be necessary or appropriate in another. And a good example is, you may want to validate derivative files that are going to become part of a released data set, but you don't want to slow down if people need to create derivatives early in the process for some ad hoc work. That may be a different scenario that you don't want to validate. You want to apply the steps at the appropriate time. So lots of good that can be done, and things that can give the users good feedback and clear trust in some of the formats that they may not really have a good method to be able to confirm are accurate and complete. From a reporting standpoint, we saw some highlights of 3D PDF reports. the XML reports, are available and also used typically behind the scenes in a lot of the automation and branching. We do have the ability to put native CADIQ data back into a PLM system, but one of the things that we're really excited about is with our CADIQ 14 release, which, by just coincidence is releasing today, we're introducing a new WebGL capability to look at CADIQ results. And, that is something that, we see as a very useful thing to consider as you want to give users more access to review results. So what do we mean by more access? Today there are really two ways to look at the validation output if you want to see more than just the pass-fail status. There's the CADIQ application itself, and that has a lot of great functionality to interrogate and really understand the differences in the model, but it is a thick client, so it's licensed. It has to be installed if you want to look at the CADIQ results natively. The 3D PDF report is much more flexible. This is overwhelmingly what we see interest in going back into PLM because this has unlimited access. Everybody already has Adobe installed, so it's no licensing required, no software required. But at the end of the day, it's Adobe Reader, so there's limited functionality other than viewing the content of the document. So there are some pros and cons to each approach, and really the idea was Adobe Reader isn't very extensible to add functionality, so we're offering this new capability to publish CADIQ results to a WebGL data standard that can be streamed and accessed through an existing, just the user's web browser. And so the idea here is to take all the functionality and capability to mark things up or disposition as we talk about them, and eventually add that into web-based access. So you get the same benefit of not needing a license to look at the results and interact with them, and you can do that through your web browser, so you don't have to install software. And here's just a quick visual, of what that could look like, and in this case, instead of accessing a PDF report, you would have the option of accessing a hyperlink that would take you to, this streaming data set and have the ability to go and interrogate the results in the same way, see all the different content that CADIQ found, navigate through, and the plan is to also extend dispositioning capability to be able to mark up, do things like ignore, comment on, group together different changes, so that if you wanted to generate a change report where a hole moved and changed size, you may want to note that the hole moving location, the diameter change, and all the PMI changes, the PMI that calls out the whole diameter, all those items are related to one action, from a change perspective. So again, using an ability in your web browser to eventually go in and do that, and that capability will be coming soon. But this, if you're interested in learning more about the WebGL capability, keep your eyes open and on email. We'll have some webinars scheduled in the future to highlight this in a little more detail. So all of that said, I'll wrap up kind of with the benefits we've seen in automating the CADIQ tool. Big one is eliminating the need for users to have to do non-value added stuff like staging data and doing the runtime. So no software installation, no waiting for an analysis to complete because it's happening, in a queued manner on the server. This can enable people to get better early feedback in the design stream, take care of things. A lot of the issues, may exist, in the data and don't change a lot, revision to revision. So finding them early is very helpful. And then just that digital trust. We've been STEP and a lot of these derivative files have been used for decades, but they were always backed up by a drawing. If we were unsure of, what the STEP file provided, there was always that drawing backstop to say this is the representation. Well, as we go towards a digital world and reduced and eliminated drawings, it's more important than ever that we have confidence that all those data formats that we include in the digital thread, that they're all complete and accurate according to their purpose and their use. And the goal is to do this with as little manual time and effort as possible. So certainly there are appropriate points to have people review the validation results and make decisions about whether an item is of concern or not. But outside of those human decisions, try to remove the the time and effort required to get to those human decisions. So with that said, I will open up the floor and let Kristen, bring any questions that might have come forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. I appreciate the presentation. So we do have quite a few questions that came in. We will try to get to as many as we can in the next handful of minutes. We did parking lot 30 minutes for this presentation, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But if you do have extra questions, please keep adding them to the chat and we will respond back to you after the presentation is complete. So our first question is, do you have a good handle on managing false positive situations where a diagnostic presents, but it presents in an undesirable situation?
Yeah, certainly. So, a false positive is something that you have to consider, and there's an extensive ability to tweak the templates to reduce those, but that is an important consideration. And we definitely help customers identify if there are false positives. Those are things that you do not want to. Those are diagnostics that you would want to turn off typically in an automated environment. That's not something that you want to take a diagnostic, because a false positive is really finding something that is a technical difference, but not necessarily an important one. And so, if it's not important, you want to turn that off and get it out of the automated rule check so that you don't confuse users.
Okay, the next question, we use Checkmate. Is CADIQ a replacement for this?
Good question, and no, CADIQ, most of our clients that use CADIQ will use it in parallel to tools like Checkmate. So whether it's Checkmate and NX or Model Check or any other tool, CADIQ really focuses on the quality of a model for reuse. So even though there may be a little bit of overlap, a tool like Checkmate is a great complement to CADIQ, because that will focus on things like NX best practices and things that CADIQ isn't focused on. So it's typically complementary.
Okay, where can CADIQ find derivative files in PLM?
Okay. So that is something, when you're integrating CADIQ, flexibility and configurability is important. Using the example we saw today, it's typical that the files CADIQ is interested in are going to be attached to the CAD document, either as an attachment or a representation. And then there is the ability, within the integration to configure code to look for other related documents. When you're talking about Team Center, that's typically you're finding other data sets on an item. So those are the most common places. But with any integration, that's usually a very client-specific question, because the PLM systems can be deployed in lots of ways, and that data model may be customized. So, we do expect and sometimes find that we have to look in unique places.
Okay, so we'll take one more question and then we'll answer the rest of them after the webinar. Does CADIQ have a digital certification such as blockchain, which could be used as a certification for the file?
Today we don't use any blockchain technology, so we do produce, reports in the various formats I mentioned, but those are not currently using blockchain. So it's a great question. It is something that our product management team has talked about. So if you're interested in more detail there, we would be happy to connect you with the right people and hear, what your initiatives are and how that would be helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Tony. Also, anybody else has any questions, please feel free to keep throwing them in the questions window. We will answer them after the webinar. I do want to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar on automating digital CAD validation. Like I mentioned before, I will send out a link for you to rewatch this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at info@iti-global.com, and we'll be in touch shortly. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.